Results felt like everyone in the voting body was just filling in their booking slip for who they thought would win the Oscars and then accidentally handed it into BAFTA and it became the results. But yeah, it's, well, we won't get bogged down in talking about that. This is Cinema Eclectica, the Geek Show's dedicated movie podcast. I'm your host, Graham, and this week I've been joined by...
Cornelius! Well, no, not Cornelius. I'm actually Tim. We don't have a Cornelius on the show, sadly.
Yeah, if you are called Cornelius, please write in, because it's a fantastic name and we'd love to have a Cornelius.
Yeah, if you're Cornelius, you can get in touch with us at totally fake email address at cinemaeclectica.edu.
.edu, yes.
Yeah, .edu, yeah.
We are a recognised community college.
For tax purposes.
Yes.
Yeah, technically,
yes.
For tax purposes, we're a dentistry practice.
The Golden Fang, yes.
What's this podcast supposed to be about again, Graham? It's films.
No one can remember.
Yeah.
I'm Graham, that's Tim. Later on, we'll have Aidan reviewing The Lighthouse in our special new release-tastic off-the-shelf section. I'll be doing Queen and Slim, and Tim, I believe you've seen The Man Who Killed Don Quixote.
Yes, to my utter disbelief in my lifetime, I have seen The Man Who Killed Don Quixote. So it rather raises the question of what next? You know, what wonders can we expect to see?
In a lot of ways, life has nothing to work towards now, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our generation's equivalent of like the moon landings or something, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, before that, we have a Director's Lottery result, and last week the Director's Lottery came out with Tony Richardson. So, Tim, would you like to present your marvellous joke to the listeners?
No, I wouldn't. Well, my joke was only to say Tony Richardson, wasn't he the guy who played Baldrick? Which he wasn't. It's very weak material, isn't it, Graham? I mean, it's really below even the usual standard of Cinema Eclectica, and that's not, let's face it, it's not a high bar.
I mean, it's not great, but by the time we realised the mix-up, we had watched half a season of Time Team in preparation for this show.
Yeah.
So, listeners, that's what you're not getting that. Richardson... It's an interesting one, because we had reviewed quite a few of his heavy hitters on the show previously. I know Aidan had done The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner and The Border. Sarah had done The Entertainer. George had actually written a review for the website of Tom Jones, his biopic of the time the Welsh singer spent as a sort of sexy 17th century nobleman. But so we found ourselves without the ability to do some of Richardson's most famous films again. So we went the other way. We went for one that is so rare it has never been released on any home viewing format.
Yeah. So it's been shown on TV a couple of times, seemingly. And
yes.
We just have to say, as I suppose, a disclaimer to the listeners: getting hold of a copy of this or finding it anywhere, you are on your own, really.
Basically, yeah. There are like things floating around from its TV premiere, but there is no way, as far as I'm aware, to see an official version. So I think, one of the things that we like to argue for is sometimes things should be on home release, and regardless of your feelings about Laughter in the Dark, it is very silly that a major film by a major British director has never been issued even on VHS. That's mad.
Yeah.
So Laughter in the Dark is adapted from a novel by Vladimir Nabokov, the author of Lolita. It's the story of a middle-aged academic man who is undone by his obsessive love for a much younger woman, which makes me think that if I ever met Nabokov, I think the first question I would ask him is, where do you get all your crazy ideas from?
Yeah. I've got to... I say going into this, I'm not especially familiar, to be honest, with... I mean, I haven't read much of Nabokov. I've read Lolita. I haven't read the novel this came from, and I haven't actually seen, I don't think, any of Richardson's other films. So
right.
I may be the only complete ignoramus going into this, really, but
So that's quite exciting in a way, isn't it?
It
or
is.
Is it?
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to clash in our overall opinions. To tell you the truth, I did not feel especially impressed by Laughter in the Dark, and I wondered how much of it was kind of weaknesses of the novel that have come through to the screen, because I sort of think the reputation of this novel seems to be that it's kind of a trial run for Lolita.
Yes.
It's kind of a slightly watered-down version, and a lot of the same kind of themes made it into Lolita, and then have made it into film adaptations of Lolita,
Yeah.
several of which
the
are good.
Kubrick one, and yeah.
But Laughter in the Dark, which was made, what year was it, 1969 or 1970?
69, yeah.
Yeah. To me, comes across as, I don't know, just kind of a slight misfire at some of the same targets. It's got...
Yeah.
The main character is played by,
Nicol Williamson.
Nicol Williamson, who is, I think, quite squarely in kind of being an it's that guy, isn't he? It's
Yeah. If you've seen like any major Shakespeare adaptation of the 1960s or 70s, you'll have seen Nicol Williamson in something.
Yeah. I recognise him from, I think is it The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes? Is that him?
Oh, yes, you're right,
Yeah.
It is.
So there's some old Sherlock Holmes. I think it's The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes that he was in. And he's one of those actors where I sort of think, well, he's kind of competent. On the other hand, I can see why he sits in that kind of realm of kind of vague recognisableness and Shakespeare adaptations for that reason. I kind of felt he was quite good in this, but didn't have a particularly good character to dig his teeth into. I don't know. I think Williamson is a character actor, and he's a very good character actor, but it's worth reflecting on the fact that Richardson's original choice for the lead role was Richard Burton, and he had to fire Richard Burton halfway through because Burton was just turning up late and drunk out of his head, which I have to say, if you hire Richard Burton, I mean... What did you expect? What do you think he was paying for? Anyway, yeah. But the story of Laughter in the Dark, more or less, is that Nicol Williamson plays this pretty much kind of like, I don't know if you say upper-class man, a reasonably well-off art critic or art historian who arbitrarily, at random, falls in love with a usherette at a cinema and kind of sets her up as his mistress, and then gets increasingly entangled with her and an ex-boyfriend of hers who get to the point of trying to kind of scam him out of his money.
Yeah.
Only the exact kind of emotional relationship between those characters, and also between Nicol Williamson's character. I've forgotten the name of the main character again.
Oh, so have I, actually.
What's his actual name,
Edward.
Graham? Yeah,
Edward.
He has a wife and family in it as well, who, to be fair, are pretty peripheral, really. It seemed like they could have been much more involved in the story. But it more or less has kind of like, Act 1, the first half is set in London, and then the second half sort of decamps to the French Riviera.
Yeah, and I assume, I'm not entirely sure, but I assume it must have been a French-British co-production, because it does have that feeling when the plot moves to France of, darling, I'm so happy, shall we move to somewhere which has given us a tax credit scheme for the second half of this film?
Yeah. The only kind of slight problem I have with this, I mean, it has a slight kind of, there's a vague sort of swinging 60s sort of modernity encroaching kind of vibe with the clash between the lifestyle of the main character and his mistress, Margot, who immediately on being set up as his mistress buys lots of plastic inflatable furniture and that sort of thing. And generally speaking, gets in the way of the kind of large country house that he lives in, where he sits around, and also his job of very, very carefully explaining paintings at the National Gallery.
Oh, yeah, some of which I quite liked, I must admit. I thought that was a fun little diversion.
Oh, okay. Although I have to admit, seeing him in that kind of role was sort of like, well, yes, he's an art historian, because you can then show various paintings on screen, and it's like, isn't this the most generic boilerplate kind of literary device where there are paintings now in shot that are going to resonate with the themes of the story somehow?
Yes. It is completely obvious, but it always basically works for me, I must admit. The other thing that's worth noting in terms of the central casting, I think, is that Margot is played by Anna Karina, who died, I think, towards the end of last year and is, iconic for her work with Jean-Luc Godard in films like My Life to Live, Alphaville, Pierrot Le Fou, Made in USA. And it's one of those odd things, isn't it, that when you compare this to a story like Later, you don't get the love affair as being something pathological, as being something that has the seeds of tragedy in it, because it's Anna Karina who wouldn't go off with her.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense that's true. On the other hand, it's kind of like, it's softened slightly by what I found rather just kind of slightly implausible in the pacing of it at the start, which is pretty much that Edward catches a sight of her serving ice creams at the cinema.
Yeah.
And pretty much just kind of starts stalking her for a little bit.
Yes.
Kind of arbitrarily following her around and finding excuses to get close to her. And then pretty much within a space of, say, a couple of afternoons in the story, manages to get her to kind of accept the status of being his mistress. And it's sort of, it just literally all that happens in the space of the first 10 minutes or something?
I mean, it's very accelerated, but part of you is thinking, I've seen movies which have a similar kind of, they meet and immediately fall in love structure. I don't think it's quite sort of weird and mad enough to justify what happens at the end when... I did feel a bit, I was going to say blindsided, but that would come off as a really dreadful pun.
Yeah. We can spoil this film as much as we like, can't we? I mean, people have had 50 years to watch it. I mean, they haven't actually, because it's not been available anywhere.
I think we should be able to spoil it, because somewhat bizarrely, the tagline on the poster I'm looking at is, Edward's blind, wee...
Right.
It's a wonder that this didn't pack him in on release, isn't it?
Yeah. So yeah, he gets blinded during the course of the film. It's not completely clear whether that's permanent or temporary. It might be permanent, mightn't it? Well, in effect.
Yeah, it's not clear. It could be like a shock-induced blindness. It's not obvious.
So basically, he gets blinded during an accident, and this is kind of creates the bizarre situation in the second half of the movie, where he's still living with his mistress, with Margot.
Yeah.
But she's also got her other lover, her kind of previous boyfriend who she's got back together with, living in the same house as him, but without Edward being aware of him.
Yes.
So it gets to the very peculiar situation where the other boyfriend is just kind of remaining completely silent. And so he and Margot are just completely making fools out of Edward and more or less getting him to sign checks without him knowing what he's signing.
And you think what author could have, what filmmaking team could have drawn the best out of this concept? And I think maybe the Carry On team?
Yeah. There would have been the potential for a lot of laughs, to be honest, out of the... yeah. But the only downside of this, in a way, that's quite a good hook to have hung the drama off, I thought, as like a kind of perverse device that creates this weird situation. And also that it kind of would be the sort of culmination of the characters' kind of paranoia and mutually sort of not trusting each other. And it rightly in some cases. But in a funny sort of way, it's a shame that it isn't more central to the movie, because it kind of happens, like 2/3 of the way through?
Yeah.
And it kind of produces the last act. And it, in a funny sort of way, makes a lot of the earlier stuff then become kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, I remember thinking, well, this has kicked into gear far too late, really. I found it far more compelling than the earlier love triangle stuff. Yeah.
And it's, you also have kind of that Nicol Williamson, again, giving a decent-ish performance, but having to pretend, having to act blind, doesn't do that brilliant a job of it, in a way, partly because the character, after being blinded, has to keep kind of doing stuff that advances the plot in various ways. And I was kind of left thinking, you could get a whole drama movie just out of someone being blinded. If he was blinded at the start of the movie, do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
If anything, he kind of gets used to it too quickly. It's like if something like that happened to me, if I was suddenly blinded, then kind of the whole rest of the movie, you wouldn't get me involved in any other concerns in life for quite some time, really.
Yeah, it's a full-time job being blind, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's like, well, it would seem to me there's enough compelling human drama to be had there, probably, and kind of about the human condition. And this guy already had an unbelievably complex kind of love triangle going on before being blinded. And then he has to be kind of go from being perfectly healthy to having been blinded and then settled up in this weird house, in this weird situation, and kind of just back to kind of carrying on in that situation.
Yeah, this is probably not going to be a terribly Tim-friendly reference point, but when I was trying to think of things that Nicole Williamson playing blind reminded me of, I couldn't really get past that interlude in Anchorman 2 where Will Ferrell is temporarily blinded.
I don't know if I've even seen Anchorman 2. I don't know. Yeah, all right, fine, yeah. So I don't know. I don't think they ever went quite as badly wrong as unintentional comedy. But on the other hand, it felt like
it had a few bits. I'm very fond of the line. I'm very fond of the line so much so that I wrote it down where Margot says, "I'm so happy. I don't want anything to go wrong." At which point you sort of half expect there to be an ominous rumble of thunder outside the window.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is, I've got to admit one thing, that while there are good points to laughter in the dark, which I thought was quite... I was sitting there and I quite enjoyed that sort of scene that gives it its title at the start, because it starts with him more or less at the cinema, sitting in the darkness, and this is where he gets his first look at Margot selling ice creams.
Yeah.
And the audience all around him, Edward, is laughing uproariously at this film, which you don't see, which is a comedy, obviously, in this kind of dark cinema. And he's just sitting there in total silence with no reaction to it at all. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting kind of image. How is that going to be reflected later in some way? And I suppose that does resonate with the blindness that turns up later in the plot.
The isolation of it, yeah.
Yeah. But I just kind of felt overall that the movie doesn't end up sort of tragic enough in a funny sort of way. And part of this is the fact that I thought the main character was such a twerp for a lot of the running time of the movie.
Yes.
I mean, he's kind of meant to be, and obviously comes to some pretty kind of unpleasant results. But there was part of that thing of how he comes across Margot in the first place and manages to get her, installed in an apartment as his mistress.
Yeah.
The script felt like it had a little bit of that kind of slightly irritating male fantasy to it, where he's somehow just able to sort of stalk her, and he's like 45 years old, and she's a gorgeous young woman who he comes across, and within about 2 days, she seems to have impulsively fallen in love with him for some reason.
That's like I was saying earlier, in terms of a relationship where you think this has bad portents about it. It just seemed like a very unoriginal way to have a midlife crisis, really, running off with this gorgeous young French woman.
Yeah.
It didn't really feel compelling in and of itself.
But he goes on, he treats her, he doesn't exactly treat her badly, but he treats her so kind of patronisingly, really. He basically says, "Oh, don't be silly, my dear," in response to everything that she says and does. Even though a lot of it is actually pretty silly, but nevertheless.
Yeah.
And the other thing was that we get kind of a lot of attention paid to his domestic arrangements, so his huge sort of manor house that he lives in, and his servants and his chauffeur and the maid at his house and his wife and his daughters. Does he have 2 daughters, or does he just have 1? I thought perhaps the fact I'm unaware of this perhaps illustrates how badly they were handled in the plot, which is that not only did the family kind of just drop out of view, but they actually do it at one point in the form of one of his young daughters, their children, dies of some illness partway through.
Yes, yeah.
And I was kind of amazed, really, that was handled in such a cursory way, which is more or less that at some point he gets a phone call saying she's very, very ill, and he has to choose whether is he going to dash back to London or is he going to stay with his girlfriend, in effect.
It is literally that bit from Armando Iannucci's David Copperfield, where David's told that, his mother's very ill, seriously ill, incredibly ill. In fact, she's dead.
Yeah. Yeah, it is kind of like that. I mean, it's also that I wasn't sure how kind of seriously to take that. I mean, whether to regard this as her getting properly fridged, if you know what I mean by that, which is more or less that the little girl gets killed in order to advance the main character's kind of plot of how badly wrong he's gone and how he's screwed things up by running off with this young woman. And then he says, how unpleasant a character are we supposed to think he is in himself? Because he immediately says after she's died, he says, this is her death is a judgment on me, which I thought was...
I forgot that line.
Which was kind of an unbelievably kind of self-important sort of conceited thing where it's just like, oh, well, he's just instantly interested in how it matters to him or what it's got to do with him. And are we kind of supposed to agree with that or not? Are we supposed to think he's completely wrong, or are we supposed to think that that's just him saying the actual subtext to the movie? But
I don't know, and I get what you mean. It is hard to tell with that stuff. There is obviously meant to be some level of critique to this character, but it's also, like I say, it's hard to know what Nabokov and Richardson are really morally judging him for. If it's just for being a bit selfish and having his head turned by a younger woman, it scarcely seems like the kind of interesting pathology you'd need to labour over for a whole movie.
Yeah, and especially not with the kind of funny sort of structure of it, where the main sort of eventful bit really doesn't start till well into the second half. Yeah. The first half quite easily works as sort of prologue, and you also have this slightly kind of farcical bit where he's trying to conceal his girlfriend from his wife to the point of practically like opening and closing doors in the house and moving people between hiding places behind curtains and that kind of stuff.
Again, the sort of carry-on quality of it that kept coming through.
So, I mean, I don't know if I want to, all I can say is, kind of in summary, I didn't find it to be that compelling for those kind of reasons. I just felt like it slightly fell flat. I mean,
Yeah, I liked it in terms of filling in a spot on my Anna Karenina checklist, but I don't think it has anything particularly successful about it beyond just a sort of good central cast.
Yeah, I mean, it also comes down to the fact that there's kind of the main character and his family are so preposterously sort of privileged at the start. They seem to live in this absolutely gigantic house, and he has this job, basically running the National Portrait Gallery or whatever it is. And it's sort of like, well, he does manage to come pretty much totally unstuck in the course of the film.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it's kind of, I was still left sort of thinking, well, how much of the time can I spend actually worrying about his situation, really? I was just kind of thinking, well...
Yeah. And it's kind of weird because, of course, the thing that broke Richardson through, the thing that made him his name, was things like Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, A Taste of Honey, Look Back in Anger, serious movies about people struggling to get by.
Yeah.
And it may be that in transferring his work to the upper crust, maybe Richardson just found them as hard to warm to as we do watching it. I don't know.
Yeah. So I don't know if we can recommend... Do we want to recommend people putting the effort to actually seek this out? I mean, I suppose if you're a fan of Richardson's work, at least out of curiosity, and it does have some redeeming qualities. I'll tell you what else, the actual directorial style of it I quite enjoyed. He tends to like, it seems, quite kind of sharp cuts, where you...
Yes, yeah.
You jump straight from kind of, the cause of something straight to the consequence of it.
I think he grasps that it's a very kind of swinging 60s style, and he pulls it off well for someone whose roots were, as I say, in a very different kind of 60s cinema. I did find it a pleasure on that front. Yeah,
and he doesn't overdo it particularly, but who's the actor playing the other boyfriend?
A guy called Jean-Claude Drouot, who is Belgian. I'm not terribly familiar with him.
Okay. I'm afraid I did that thinking he looked familiar in some way, but now I can't pin down anything, and I can't imagine what I would have seen him in. I don't know.
Oh, he's in Happiness by Agnes Varda, which has been on my to-watch list for a very long time, so I haven't seen him in anything, but I should be soon.
Perplexed by the pompous, ponderous piffle purveyed by normal art critics? Well, you've come to the right place. because we're not normal. We take a not-so-serious look at the serious worlds of art and literature. Join Sarah, Andrew, Rob and Graham for a piffle-free journey through the cultural landscape of the 21st century. Literary loitering. Because you can't make a cultural omelette without smashing a few eggheads.
So if you're enjoying what you're listening to, you can help us continue to make these podcasts by donating to our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Geek Show. We are moving heavily into YouTube at the moment with several original video series, including our flagship podcast, The Geek Show, which is now video. You can find that by searching YouTube for The Geek Show, or following us on Twitter at TGS_The Geek Show. So, yes, if you do go on to thegeekshow.co.uk, you can read some written reviews of things that we're not going to do on the show, like Failsafe, the 1960s nuclear war thriller that's out now on Criterion. Ewan Gledhouse reviewed that for you. And also the classic British courtroom drama The Winslow Boy, scripted by Terence Rattigan and directed by Anthony Asquith, and I've reviewed that. But for now, it's time for our question of the week, and since we do have The Man Who Killed Don Quixote coming up, there was nothing else we could ask, really. Which unmade film do you most wish you could see? Now, on our Facebook, Andy Winwood was particularly enthusiastic about this. He said, Superman Lives, the frankly balmy-looking Nicolas Cage, Tim Burton version from the late 90s.
I kind of feel that had to be in the category of things where it's like, well, I'd like to see it. I couldn't possibly imagine it being anything other than a disaster, really. I don't know how I could take the idea of Nicolas Cage as Superman remotely seriously. That sounds completely grotesque, but...
Yeah, I think I'm kind of with you on that, although... I don't know, the more we get into this current age of superhero movies, the more I do miss the time when people just used to throw properties at people like Tim Burton and Guillermo del Toro and say, it's a comic book, do what you want with it.
Yeah.
So he nominated that. He said the sequels to John Carter that Andrew Stanton was planning, which were never made because, of course, the first was famously unsuccessful.
Yeah, weird that. On the other hand, I mean, I don't know, it doesn't feel like that tragic a loss, really, but that was all so kind of flawed at that. Well, anyway, yeah.
He also said, and this is true, by the way, listeners, if you haven't heard it, there was a 1960s attempt to film Lord of the Rings with the Beatles. That's just letting that sink in.
Yeah. See, I mean... half of these answers are just like delirious dreams somebody could have had. I mean, you could put Jodorowsky's Dune in the same category, really, of saying, well, someone had some sort of psychedelic nightmare that, translated into a single vision. And it's like, well, how close was that to ever actually getting made? Probably not that close, but...
I'm glad you mentioned Jodorowsky's Dune, because Mark Lawrence said, and I think this is absolutely both an answer and a sentiment we can all agree with, I don't want to see it, but I wish Jodorowsky's Dune had been made.
Yeah, that's a very good answer, yeah.
Some others from Facebook. Phil Lowther says, a Transformers film that isn't
Whoa! Okay. That's a bit of an abstract interpretation of the question. All right, fine.
Also, Gundam Wing with Trace, played by James Purefoy. That probably means something. I don't know what.
Yeah.
Luke Dan says Tron 3, also Neil Blomkamp's Alien film, and his Halo film, come to mention it.
Neil Blomkamp's what? Alien film?
He was going to do an Alien film that was like a direct sequel to Aliens. And it fell through because I think Fox was in the midst of thinking this Prometheus thing is really going to work.
Yeah.
Speaking of things that were probably derailed by Prometheus, Andrew Young from our sister shows Literary Loitering and 4Panel says absolutely has to be Del Toro's At the Mountains of Madness.
Which it won't surprise you to learn was going to be my answer as well, yeah.
I think everyone has a bit of a place in their heart for Guillermo del Toro's At the Mountains of Madness.
Oh, yes. I don't know. Is there any chance of it happening now? I don't suppose there is. What might have been? Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, you'd hope that now Del Toro is an Oscar-winning director, that would give him a bit of clout. Mark Harrison says, the version of Watchmen that was going to be directed by Paul Greengrass with Paddy Considine as Rorschach.
Wow, okay.
I don't know how he'd have tackled that material, but that is a bloody good piece of casting. And the last of the Facebook answers is Oliver Lewis, who says Orson Welles' Heart of Darkness, or indeed one of his other many, many unmade films. More Orson Welles is always good.
Yeah.
So to round off, we'll just go to Twitter. Rob Simpson says, Ash versus Freddy versus Jason was destined to be a banger. It was turned into a comic, but unfortunately is out of print. Also, George A. Romero wrote a script for a Resident Evil movie. Was pretty great, but the studio went with that Spaniel's arsehole Paul W.S. Anderson. Spaniel's arsehole is a good insult. Aidan also answers, I think rather peevishly, but let's go on. Dear Cinema Eclectica, since my question of the week answer was not read out on the last show, I will be tweeting my original response again, along with answering this question because I feel like being a pain in the arse.
Yeah, this is a bit of a, feeling slightly self-important there. You can't, not just anyone gets on this show with question of the week answers. For every question of the week answer you hear, there are probably 10 others that are just left completely... Or not
if question of the week answer, if question of the week answer isn't read out on the show, has it even been answered? As Confucius famously asked.
Yeah.
But yeah, he says his films that he's looking forward to this year. Obviously, a huge fan of anything Michael Bay. Big Alex Ross Perry fan. Happy to see Adam Sandler stop doing that Uncut Gems rubbish and do some of his great comedy. He doesn't say any of this actually. I'll read out the proper answer he gave.
Yeah.
He says, films from 2020 that I am looking forward to include Charlie Kaufman's I'm Thinking of Ending Things, Spike Lee's The Five Bloods, and Christopher Nolan's Tenet. As for unmade films that I would love to have seen, Kubrick's Aryan Papers comes to mind, as does Sergio Leone's Leningrad. But Del Toro's At the Mountains of Madness takes the case, because it would almost guarantee a good Lovecraft adaptation that isn't Reanimator. So, what do we have?
Well, I mean, my only one I'd really thought of was At the Mountains of Madness by Del Toro, which again we kind of know is quite famously a tragic loss. Certainly, like fans of H.P. Lovecraft will think, well, I don't know whether we could have expected it to be a masterpiece. I don't know. I mean, I suppose there's still a slim hope that it might get made in some way. But on the other hand, the place it occupies in kind of cinema history of thinking about John Carpenter's The Thing being a sort of semi-connected to that kind of quasi-adaptation. There's a load of stuff from the original book that obviously everyone's a fan of that actually did make it into The Thing. And,
right.
Well, it depends. It's maybe one of the things we're over-reading it, but thinking, you've got the idea of the kind of shape-shifting monster, which is partly from At the Mountains of Madness, and there's a little, there's an element of that in The Thing, obviously. You've got the kind of the sort of, what's the word, desiccated corpses of dogs and that kind of thing that have been eviscerated, which is something discovered in At the Mountains of Madness, which is done by the thawed-out aliens that are found in blocks of ice, or seemingly.
Right.
And I don't know, it just seemed to me that there was kind of enough attempts at some of the bits of horror from the original book in John Carpenter's The Thing as to suggest that that was one of the inspirations. On the other hand, of course, it cuts out the element that's by far the most expensive, which is the ability to build like a 100-mile wide alien city on a mountaintop.
Yeah, that's going to cost you, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's a book where, the story of the book has virtually nothing set in the kind of the normal inhabited world in the present day or anything like that. It pretty much starts in the Antarctic wilderness, goes to completely bananas locations that are outside of all human experience, which is the whole point, and then ends in the Antarctic wilderness. Yeah. So, I mean, the controversial point about it was always, how was it going to be made as like, a proper gory horror film? Or was it going to get kind of toned down to the point where the really nasty stuff in it would have to get kind of filtered out and you'd end up with more of a kind of dark fantasy adventure movie? Not that wouldn't necessarily work. I think I'd have been quite happy watching either of them, really. And the key element, in a way, would be the really, really grotesque creatures, which would be, could be rather like the ones in Pan's Labyrinth and the Devil's Backbone and the kind of stuff you see in the Hellboy movies.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. For me, Aidan brought up Stanley Kubrick, and it is worth noting that Stanley Kubrick tried to get the rights to Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco.
Sorry, Kubrick did?
Yes, he did, yeah.
Wow, okay. I don't even know how you'd go about adapting that or what it would look like, really.
No, I've got no idea either. It's an incredibly dense book. Echo said that he turned Kubrick down because he was disappointed with the film version of The Name of the Rose, although Echo did also say that once he got over that disappointment, he spent most of the rest of his life kicking himself.
Oh, yeah, well. On the other hand, it's kind of difficult to imagine the process that could possibly have led to getting a really good movie out of Foucault's Pendulum. Yes. I mean, it's like, well, the book will be difficult enough material to start with, and then Kubrick, well, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. The other one that always comes to mind is that shortly before Harpo and Chico Marx both died, they were in talks with Billy Wilder to reunite the Central Three Marx brothers for a comedy where they'd all play UN diplomats.
Okay, that sounds pretty good.
That would have been pretty amazing, yeah. And, Wilder was at the peak of his powers then. He could absolutely have done it, but, just slightly too late, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, since we've had some words from Aidan, and we've slandered Aidan as well, shall we go for a review from Aidan?
Yeah, all right. Let's hear what he's got to say.
So I've been watching Robert Eggers' new film, The Lighthouse, which is his follow-up to The Witch, which came out around about 2016. We actually reviewed it on the show back when it was first released in cinemas. And good lord, I remember when we reviewed The Witch, and part of the reason why I think a lot of us loved it was because it was just such an exciting turn of voice for Eggers to partake in. He's a very exciting new filmmaker emerging. But it's one of these films that, honestly, once you see it once, you will never want to see it ever, ever again. And part of the reason why I was so enticed by The Lighthouse is because it's seemingly taking a similar step, but also evolving his style in terms of authenticating history and obviously taking us towards this specific point in like the 1890s in this specific instance, and just transforming it into a new kind of like eerily dark place that we haven't really seen before, and something that differentiates itself from the trees and the long grass found in The Witch, but also into this rugged island found in The Lighthouse. So The Lighthouse is set at the late 1890s Maine. It stars two lighthouse keepers. One is an old-timer, has very much heavy-handed experience against the seas, played by Willem Dafoe, who plays his character called Thomas Wake. And then we also have Robert Pattinson's character, who plays Abraham Winslow, the apprentice who joins Dafoe's character as they have to tend to the lighthouse and take really good care of it, essentially. And then, slowly but surely, things don't go according to plan, to put it in the barest sense of the word. Because what happens is that a hell of a lot of bad luck begins to befall the both of them. So what you have here is like, say for example, storms begin to close in on the island as they're tending to the lighthouse. Sometimes there's a lack of trust between the pair of them. So Thomas Wake does not want Abraham Winslow anywhere near the beacon at all times. So he always like grumpily locks him away, like slams the girder of the platform in front of his face, essentially, while, Winslow is doing like all these different chores around the lighthouse. So you do get this rugged sense of tension between the pair of them. And furthermore, it also draws inspiration from different myths as well. So say, for example, like folklore. So say, for example, there's a segment where, particularly where the seagulls are concerned, because the seagulls, in the light of this film, are seen as kind of the Black Phillip of The Lighthouse, of course, if you don't know what Black Phillip is, if you haven't seen The Witch, Black Phillip was the goat that obviously was the core symbol of that film. And the seagulls play a similar sort of role here, but much less, a bit more different, I would say, actually, from what Black Phillip was in The Witch. In particular, what the seagulls represent are essentially like the lost souls of sailors who were lost at sea. And Defoe, like, really just laments that onto him, is that if you decide to kill one of these precious seagulls, then we are going to be in for, like, a really bad time. And you can kind of imagine where that ends up going, because, furthermore, things do end up going really, really badly. I mean, I think Eggers actually described his film as, like, saying what would happen if two men were doomed and trapped in a giant phallus. And you could kind of see the sense in that, because it is a very isolated, very boxed-in kind of film. Of course, shot in a 4x3 framing device at all times in black and white, where you are immersed in the film tenfold, because everything is done in The Lighthouse to authenticate the period. I mean, I think it goes without saying that Eggers actually designed The Lighthouse along with his talented crew alongside it, so he built the place from the ground up. And, you know, normally that seems a bit unusual for me, because I think we get used to, like, obviously people filming on location. Like, if there's a castle, no one will actually go out to build, like, a new castle from scratch. But I think since Eggers is caught up with his own contraptions, I think that helps him, like, breathe functionality into this, like, very just haunting island that he's got set sail for both Pattinson and Defoe. For me, I found The Lighthouse to be an utterly enticing film. First of all, I think going into this with this in mind, because it is essentially a two-man show, what you've got on here, between Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson. Now, you do get occasional glimpses of other characters in this lighthouse. Like, for example, in the opening shot, you do get, like, a sense of these characters helping, I believe they're sailors, actually, who help both Winslow and Wake into, like, setting up a shop at the lighthouse. You also get the sense of, like, surrealistic visions that Winslow is beginning to have with this mermaid, which I'll get onto in a little bit. But really what you got at the end of the day is a two-man show, like a two-man fist fight, this really bloodied, intense fist fight. Often at a tense where they're competing in volume between Pattinson and Defoe. And my God, if there's two actors who I can, like, see, like, going against each other like this, it is definitely those two. Because it goes without saying that Willem Dafoe is, like, I believe Graham would massively, massively appreciate this, that Willem Dafoe is, like, one of the great American actors of his generation, along with, say, John Goodman. And I think with his commitment to accent here, with his commitment to, like controlled bitterness that he has towards Winslow, is very, very worthwhile to behold. I mean, there's various sequences where that he's just basically, like, berating him and really just intensely slamming his foot down on him. Like, for example, like, Pattinson missing one single spot from scrubbing the floorboards is one specific example, because he'll just, like, lament him all into saying, like, right, you're going to scrub it over and over again, and I will make you feel like this sperm whale who's lost his pecker. And it's a great... he's just a tremendous actor to behold, and just see him just, like, fully transform, full beard and all, into this role where you just think immediately to yourself, yes, this is one of the reasons why Willem Dafoe is, like, one of the greatest actors of his generation, because he can just lose himself in a role so easily. And need I mention, like, obviously the method acting was helmed here, because, you know, he actually stayed in a fishing village just outside the set during the filming of this movie, and so he truly gets lost in that world. In fact, him and Pattinson rarely spoke a word to each other on set, often taking time to themselves, which does add to the friction between the two. And then, of course, we get to Pattinson himself, who we've been banging the drum a lot lately with Pattinson. I mean, I think he is, honestly, outside of Twilight, and I know Twilight often gets, like, the bad reps from anyone who just doesn't like Pattinson whatsoever. But, you know, he's got a very interesting CV. I mean, he's worked with Claire Denis, he's worked with David Cronenberg, and now he's pit up with Eggers. And I think I'm going to lay my cards out on the table. I think this is my favourite performance Pattinson has ever done, period, for me. And I think the simplest reason is that Winslow is a character who's a lot more stubborn. He doesn't like to take orders from Wake that lightly. So, I mean, even when it comes to the smaller moments, like in the very opening scene, in one of the first scenes, actually, I should say, he goes to his bed, obviously depacks everything that he's, found from the ship that he sailed on to get to the island. And then he gets into his bed and pulls out this little statuette. Now, that is, the little statuette, I think, is very pivotal to what this film is going to be talking about, because obviously it's drawing on themes of mythology, as well as just planting, like, these little seeds in your head of, obviously, to the audience's mind, what on earth could this mean? And, of course, this could play into, like, his fantasies later on in this film, because it goes without saying that his character has a bit too much fun with himself when it comes to that statuette, to put it lightly. But there's just this eerie kind of sadness that it comes to him. I mean, there's a few scenes where when they're not competing in volume, either Dafoe or Pattinson, they're like mellowing together. I mean, there's the excellent scene between each other where they describe like their backgrounds to each other amongst like, it actually comes from the scene where the quotable scene from the trailer where Wake says to Pattinson, what has a wiki got to do with a timberman? And wiki, if you don't know what that word means, essentially what a wiki is just a 19th century term for lighthouse keeper. It's pretty easy to understand once you obviously dig research into this. And they begin sharing their thoughts and ideas with each other, which Winslow responds with, the reason why I came to this island is because I got sick of the trees in Canada. And it's got a darkly little slight sense of humour to it. I think that helps it steer away slightly from the intensity of it, the mad, raining lunacy of The Lighthouse. Because I thought it was a very authentic looking film. I mean, it goes without saying that this film was predominantly written with 19th century dialect in mind, obviously. So, obviously, someone who knows what came before on The Witch would know that, because obviously Eggers pulled a similar trick there. But with The Lighthouse, both Max Eggers and Robert, were particularly drawn influences from Robert Louis Stevenson and Herman Melville to influence the sort of structure of authenticating the period of The Lighthouse. And The Lighthouse actually began life as an adaptation of Edgar Allan Poe's unfinished short story, also titled The Lighthouse, but it was a very different in structure, largely because, well, it ends after like the fourth day or something like that. It's not, you can read it in about a minute, Poe short story. And of course, it began life as that when Eggers was originally updating the Poe short story. It didn't really go intended initially. It actually evolved into a film that was much more original, to bear in mind. So, and you do get this sense of, like, a period fully opening up towards your eyes as a result. It is just a tremendous level of research. It's kind of the same stamp someone's putting on as, like, Craig Mazin was doing recently with Chernobyl, just bathing themselves into research to fully just expand upon this film, because it helps with understanding the mythology, it helps with understanding, obviously, these characters' sensibilities, their conflicts, their everything about it, and it just makes it into one, like, explosive film. I think my only major criticism with The Lighthouse, because as much as I've gushed about how much I really enjoyed it, my time with it, even if you want to say enjoy is the right word, I think sometimes the authenticity, you can easily get lost in it, and I think this was sometimes a complaint someone could understand with The Witch. And I can certainly understand the naysayers behind this, because if you're not accustomed to 19th century dialect in this film, you're going to have a hard time with it. I think it's plain and simple as that. So, I mean, for that matter, it's better off if you are not into that. It's not going to help you, obviously, fluctuating between, like, this film, or trying to understand the plot of it, because it is, or the dialogue, or the characterization, because you just get this strong sense of evolution with it. It's a very hard film to muster in that regard. But if you like me and like to hear about, like, sea shanties, mythology, and, like, obviously two of the great actors, I think, working against each other, you're going to really have a great time with this film. It's a film that I haven't really stopped thinking about, to be perfectly honest with you. It is just a very great mind-numbing film, very raw, very intense. You are desperate to get off the island just as much as they are as soon as you watch it. And, you know, I think I am very, very excited for what Eggers cooks up next, because I think he's a very, very impressive, very talented individual. It looks stunning, need I say more. And overall, if you're looking for something a bit more different to watch, obviously definitely give The Lighthouse a look, because I can guarantee it's not going to be a film for everyone, because I think it does have a slight divisive reception to it if you're not a fan of how, you know, dour and grim this film can become. That's The Lighthouse. That's out now through A24 and select cinemas across the country. So the closest that you're going to get it, if you're from my neck of the woods, Durham, is Tyneside Cinema, because it's not going to get a mainstream audience anytime soon, just from what I've said before. So I'm very much looking forward to how this stacks up on rewatch. That's The Lighthouse, and I've been Aidan. I'm out.
Tim, what have you seen this week?
Well, back on the topic of unmade films, I've watched Terry Gilliam's The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, which
still technically counts as an unmade film, even though it's been made.
Yeah.
It was so hard to get it made that it is forever unmade.
Yeah. It's we're just going to dive into the level of confusion that's been created here. I imagine most of the listeners, although not necessarily all, are aware of some of the history of this film, which is that he made his first attempt to make it about, it must be 30 years ago now.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
And it went through the most kind of torturous production history with various actors attached for the role of Don Quixote, and not just that, but also various crazy kind of changes to the script and what the movie was actually about and how postmodern it was, and to the point where it's kind of just sort of eaten its own tail. And now it's finally been released. It was released last year, was it around the year before?
Yeah.
2018 was the first time you could see it, although where exactly it got into cinemas was variable. But
yeah, it took its time getting here.
Yeah, and it's obviously kind of, after years and years of kind of intervening Terry Gilliam films, and perhaps in the context of saying, well, almost all of Terry Gilliam's films have had this kind of Don Quixote element of fantasy protruding into them somewhere.
Yeah.
And there's some of his films that are, well, loosely speaking, there's a trilogy, isn't there? The kind of fantasists, which is to start with Time Bandits, which is children engaging in fantasy. And then you go through Brazil, which is the middle-aged man's kind of fantasy of escaping from his workplace, more or less. And then you have the old man's fantasy in The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, yeah. And that's supposedly the kind of, that's the kind of theme that runs through all of those. The only thing is, obviously, you see a certain element of that, and is it the Fisher King as well was his?
Yeah.
And obviously you could see a different interpretation again in 12 Monkeys, where this kind of, well, actually the fantasy stuff is fully going on. You have characters in the story who could be completely mad, and it could all be a delusion, but in that case turns out, more or less that it isn't, I suppose.
Yeah.
Which is quite a common outcome for this kind of thing in Gilliam's films. But now we have The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, which started out, as I understand it, originally had the French actor Jean Rochefort as Don Quixote. It had Johnny Depp as Sancho Panza, and it seemed to be, in its original form, 25 years ago, it was going to be about a modern-day character who gets transported back in time and meets Don Quixote in 16th or 17th century Spain, and gets kind of dragged into a chivalric romance adventure like that. This kind of premise has got even further tied in knots by today, when it follows Adam Driver as Toby, who is a film executive who had previously, 10 years before the events of The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, made a film, now stay with me here, called The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, in which he went to Spain and essentially made a mess of the lives of a load of people who were recruited as actors. And then back in the present day is, as a very successful film director and producer, is making again a film of Don Quixote, at which point he runs into the actor, the local Spanish elderly guy who he dragged in to play Don Quixote the first time round, and by him, who is now deluded into thinking he actually is Don Quixote, Adam Driver's character Toby, the filmmaker, is mistaken for Don Quixote's squire Sancho Panza and dragged into an adventure across the landscape of medieval Spain that is taking place kind of simultaneously with the extremely flawed and mad production of the Don Quixote film. So this film, The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, is more or less set during its own production, dealing with the consequences of a failed earlier attempt to make itself. Which, wow. I will say, mad though that sounds, is actually not. The original novel Don Quixote is that self-referential or more, because if you read Don Quixote, in later chapters, characters start turning up who have read the earlier chapters of The Adventure of Don Quixote. So it's kind of pretty much just, in a sense, it is completely faithful to the source material. And it deliberately overlaps, reality and fantasy in fairly arbitrary, kind of inconsistent ways throughout. So, sometimes you'll see things that must be part of some character's delusion, sometimes things that must be real life, and sometimes things that you can't really tell either way. And the story kind of wobbles along between the 17th century and 21st century, and the production of the film and the events that are happening to Toby gradually just merge together with the chivalric romance and the quest that Quixote thinks he is going on. There is another characteristic to look at this is that Jonathan Pryce is sort of a Gilliam. Well, I don't know if you could say he's a Gilliam regular, is he? But he was in Brazil, is probably the really famous one.
He's in Brazil. He's in Baron Munchausen. He's in The Brothers Grimm. I think. They've got.
You call him a regular. And he's usually pretty reliable. And he's kind of on the other hand, he does feel like he's sort of the fallback choice here for playing Don Quixote because, as you can see, if you watch The Man Who Killed Don Quixote and you get to the end. The comparable example I was going to draw this to is if anyone is familiar with there's a famous mathematics textbook. stay with me here. Yeah, there's a famous mathematics textbook which has an opening which some people might have heard of already, which is about the mathematician Ludwig Boltzmann, and it starts with the introduction to this textbook saying Ludwig Boltzmann was spent his whole life studying statistical mechanics, and then he committed suicide in 1905, and his work was carried on by the famous mathematician Paul Ehrenfest, who also committed suicide in 1931. And now it is our turn to study statistical mechanics. So that's the opening of this book. And The Man Who Killed Don Quixote manages almost to produce the same effect by having, a point in its credits where it said, this film is dedicated to Jean Rochefort, and then also this film is dedicated and also to John Hurt, both of whom have previously been signed up to play Don Quixote in Gilliam's film, both of whom are now dead. And now it is Jonathan Pryce's turn to play Don Quixote. But fortunately, bit of a diversion there, but Jonathan Pryce at least manages to survive it. And he puts in, Jonathan Pryce, a very kind of energetic performance as this kind of central character. It's not one that kind of produces much of a result. And this is, it's mainly due to the script of this movie. And I'd love to be able to say that this movie has like a brilliant central comic performance by Jonathan Pryce's Quixote, but it just kind of doesn't come to that much of an effect. It's right. The same problem with Adam Driver as Toby. The script just doesn't quite make him an interesting enough character for them to follow them rambling around this landscape. So, this is the main problem of it, really, is that although there's a lot of elements of it that are quite entertaining, the structure and pace of The Man Who Killed Don Quixote are an absolute mess. The whole thing is unbelievably kind of stitched together in a sense of it's kind of like, well, they obviously had random sort of patchwork of bits, which they've just about made into a... it's noticeably over 2 hours. I think it's 2 hours 15. And it's kind of like that sets the alarm bell ringing for me of thinking somebody just didn't edit this down, as ruthlessly as they should have. But
it's not a unique problem for Gilliam, though, you'd have to say.
Yeah, true. Yeah. But in effect, the story just kind of rambles around through lots of crazy incidences as, Adam Driver gets lost in the Spanish countryside and he comes across some people from the real world and some people from the kind of fancy world and some people where you can't tell. And it took me a while to kind of realise that, well, there's a lot of stuff where it just kind of feels like the start of a subplot, but then it doesn't go anywhere. There's a bit where, Toby finds a big cache of gold coins and he kind of picks these up and you think, sooner or later he's going to run into the person who actually owns those, or, it's going to become important, or they're going to use them in some way. But no, it's just kind of picked up and then nothing happens about it. And the same happens with them kind of fighting a duel and meeting various people and various eccentric characters. And if anything, it took me a while to realise, or maybe I should have realised sooner, that what the movie ends up most resembling is Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
Fancy that.
Yeah, which Gilliam co-directed 45 years earlier. And it kind of expanding on that, you're kind of left with this, once I'd thought of that, I couldn't get the idea out of my head that this is kind of like, a bit like a sort of Python sketch with a lot more money. in the sense that, the stock form of a Monty Python sketch is pretty much just to have a dose of kind of silly bathos, where there's some elaborate world like a historical period or something, or some sort of realm of fiction, and then it suddenly gets interrupted by some totally banal kind of modern concern, and which is admittedly is a pretty good way of getting a laugh out of me, really. But then I was kind of left thinking, well, is Don Quixote having these sort of chivalric fantasies and his bubble getting burst a few times over it's just barely enough to carry a kind of great big movie like this? I mean, you could say really it's not quite enough. Yeah, and there aren't enough kind of laugh out loud gags really in The Man Who Killed Don Quixote. It's a shame. I just felt like they could have just stocked it up with more funny gags that wouldn't have, there'd have been problems they still had to solve with the structure of it and the setting of it. But if anything, it just should have had more laugh out loud funny jokes. And actually, there's rather a lot of them that sort of fall flat. There's a bit like, there's a scene where the Spanish lord or something is receiving in his castle a delegation of sort of noble Muslim women who have been brought in seemingly because there's a film crew there as well, to film a scene where they've been put under a curse. And then the leading actress draws back her veil to reveal that she's grown a beard, underneath the veil. And somebody, at this point, someone on the set of the film, within the film, suddenly shouts, "Suicide bomber!" And all the security guards on the set draw their guns and kind of like secure the set. And the actors are, worried about being under threat. And I just thought, God, that was a proper kind of tumbleweed moment if that was supposed to be a joke. There's kind of bits that are just far too contrived and really, really lame. And the same thing with them occasionally dropping in these kind of jokes, like he says, "Oh, the lord of this castle is a really spoiled nobleman who must be indulged constantly by all of his courtiers and subjects. He's a bit like Trump in this respect." And it's like, oh God, they're really just, you really could have done with probably 2 or 3 or maybe 4 more drafts, of those kind of jokes, which should probably just involve, scribbling through them with a red crayon. But still, so there's a few very lame bits like that. On the other hand, there's a lot of stuff that is actually pretty good. I rather like the bit where they're on the film set at the start and he's just randomly talking on the phone, arguing with the producer, and an absolutely massive replica head of a giant just gets carried past behind him, which is pretty much just exactly the, a giant real-world version of a Terry Gilliam animation from the Monty Python days, of just a huge cut-out shape of a head suddenly passing behind him with no one commenting on it at all. It's just sort of the background of shot, and I thought that was pretty funny. And there's bits where, somebody starts kind of experiencing another character's hallucination, where there are slabs of hanging meat. They're in like a sort of, butcher's kitchen, meat hanging on hooks, which suddenly starts developing eyes, like eyes start opening on the sides of the slabs of meat as a kind of hallucination. Yeah, and there's a few things like that are completely deranged, but sadly not really enough of them. I could have done it with it being a lot madder. And the kind of story overall, I guess, is that the main character, Toby, has a bit of a slight kind of sort of Scrooge narrative where he comes along and realizes how much he mucked up the lives of these characters by kind of luring them into the production of this movie the first time round and then kind of abandoning them, and they've had a terrible time of it since. And he realizes, 10 years on, how much of a bastard he's been, really. Only, again, it's just not that strong a theme, because a lot of the time he's just required to meander around the landscape, kind of witnessing these crazy things and witnessing Don Quixote sort of misbehaving or mistaking the real world for the kind of fantasy world. And it's all so kind of clumsily slotted together, really. And it has. I'm trying to think of some more examples of it, really. I mean, there's, obviously the main image everyone knows about with Don Quixote is him charging at the windmill, because, he mistakes the windmill for a giant. And that's the really famous scene from the book and from this film as well. And so you'd think, well, there's the possible, the sight gag you can do of the modern wind turbine standing in for the medieval windmill in some way. So you could kind of do a modern adaptation of Don Quixote that does it that. And they've obviously had this idea in The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, because there's a kind of half-hearted attempt at this sight gag where they kind of stick the wind turbines in shot, which I guess is slightly ironic, but then they're also just filming the scene with the actual kind of medieval windmill as well, made out of hard, coarse cloth stretched over, sort of bits of wood. So it's weird the concept doesn't quite get sort of fully updated. And I wonder if it's just because that is too much of a departure from the famous image that everyone knows about. But the other thing is that there was one of the few kind of finished shots that looked like really good fun from Lost in La Mancha, the documentary about Gilliam's first attempt to make this 25 years ago, was the shot showing what the actual fantasy of the giants will look like. The Don Quixote has to fight the giants. And so it was these 3 great big great big fat blokes, basically, wearing, sort of giant leather rags and with big sticks, and they have very, very sort of long, shaggy hair, and they were just, sort of stomping over the landscape. And it was pretty much just kind of achieving the effect of giants just by filming these three big blokes in the correct way. And it seemed like that was quite a good way of doing it. And more or less, the promise of that is lived up to 25 years later. They do that exact scene with that exact effect the same way, and it does work really pretty well. Partly because of the sort of physique of these guys they found to play the giants.
Yeah.
Who are sort of massive beer bellies.
That bit.
Yeah, that works pretty well. It's a shame it couldn't be put in a more kind of coherent sort of story, really. But, the structure of this is pretty much that at the start, the man who killed Don Quixote opens with a scene of Quixote attacking the windmill thinking it's a giant. But of course, it's actually not the same Quixote. It's not the Jonathan Pryce Quixote, because they don't find him until he visits the village later and finds him impersonating Quixote somewhere else. It's a different actor playing Don Quixote. And later on, Toby kind of wanders off the film set. He finds Jonathan Pryce, who apparently in the intervening 10 years has been making a living pretending to be Don Quixote or something, maybe. Or almost kind of being exhibited as as a sort of like, there's a tent and you say, come in and meet Don Quixote, and he's in there.
Yeah.
In fact, it has rather a nice kind of image, which is that they have the movie screen inside the tent with a flickering old projection of is it an old Don Quixote film, I think? It's possibly some older film, but it more or less is just kind of like playing some old classic movie on the screen. And then Toby, Adam Driver's character, kind of just parts the screen and walks through the screen into it and seems to just enter the fiction there, which obviously in a way is maybe that's a kind of obvious thing to do, but it does work reasonably well when you kind of see it happen as one of the more sort of slightly surreal moments. And likewise, they have car chases, they have bike chases, he gets arrested and things like that, which overlap with the horse battles and the jousting and that kind of thing. So it's kind of, I don't know, I mean, it's just a big mess, to be honest. There's a lot of entertaining material in there. And you can watch it if you want. There's a lot of entertainment to be had. I think if you've anticipated this because of its production history, I don't see how you can be anything except a little bit disappointed, to be honest. I mean, I really wish it was a work of genius. I'd really love it to be brilliant. But I guess if you're someone who's no familiarity with Gilliam's work and not with any of his previous kind of fantastical, quixotic, kind of themed films, then there's probably something pretty new for you here. It might. It might really surprise you. It's not exactly a bad film. It's just a shame that it's not better, I suppose. Yeah. Seriously, one more note to say about that is that there is another documentary being made called He Dreams of Giants, which will continue the story of the original documentary about a failure to make Don Quixote the first time round. So it continues the story of Lost in La Mancha, which makes The Man Who Killed Don Quixote probably the only movie to have had a documentary made about how it didn't get made and also about how it did get made. It's got a separate documentary about each. It's got the failure one and it's got the success one, like kind of documentaries from two parallel universes. And that's Gilliam's The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, amazingly.
Right, so quick look at Queen and Slim, which is the first film by Melina Matsoukas, a very noteworthy music video director, particularly for her work with Beyoncé. This has, I should say first that I really enjoyed this, but this has one credit that concerned me, so let's get that out of the way first. The script is by Lena Waithe, who's most noted for her TV work, particularly as a screenwriter and actress in the comedy series Master of None. But it also has a story by credit for James Frey, the person who wrote the now discredited addiction memoir A Million Little Pieces. He still continues to write. His last novel, Katerina, was the prestigious recipient of the Bad Sex in Fiction Award. But he apparently went to Wait and said, I have a story that has got into my head, but I can't write it, which I think is very self-aware. I think there are a lot of stories James Frey cannot write, most of which he has actually published as novels. So I like that he admitted that he couldn't do this one.
Ouch.
But the reason was that this was stories specifically about the African-American experience, and it's about a couple. They are not called Queen and Slim. Their real names are revealed towards the end at kind of a moment of unveiling, I guess you can say. But for most of it, you were watching them as Queen and Slim, these slightly larger than life or Robin Hood kind of figures who go out on a date. They have absolutely no chemistry with each other whatsoever, which plays out as kind of a little structural gag because of the kind of movie this is, because of the marketing, and the posters for it are gorgeous. I mean, just when you think poster art's become boring, something like this comes along. But you know they're going to end up together, but their first date is an absolute disaster. And he is played by Daniel Kaluuya from Get Out and Black Panther. She is played by Jodie Turner-Smith, who's done a few sort of indies and some TV work, but this is a big breakout role. He is driving her home when they get pulled over by a police officer. And as generally happens, particularly in modern movies, with black people being pulled over by the police, it escalates. But they manage to get the better of the police officer, and before he can kill them, and he is going to kill them, they shoot him and drive away. And it becomes this story about them as kind of folk heroes. Queen's uncle, played by the great Bokeem Woodbine, actually makes the parallel explicit and calls them Black Bonnie and Clyde, which is kind of it, although given that the inciting incident is the killing of a police officer, I guess Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless might be a better point of comparison, which is one way of saying that this is a new film that plays into my absolute fascination with Lovers on the Run movies. I am obsessed with Lovers on the Run movies. If you ever, listeners, find yourself with a contract to make a movie and you don't know what to make it about, make a Lovers on the Run movie, because they are always better than any other kind of movie. And there were several kind of waves of these films over the years. The first wave of them was things like Gun Crazy and You Only Live Once in the film noir era. Then films like Breathless and Badlands and Bonnie and Clyde brought them back in the 60s. And then you had a sort of more ironic postmodern wave of them in the 90s with things like True Romance and Wild at Heart. So far in the 21st century, the Lovers on the Run movie has generally been done in a parodic register. Things like Ben Wheatley's Sightseers or Wes Anderson's Moonrise Kingdom, for example. And this is very serious. I mean, it's fun, but it's very serious. And I think part of the reason why it hasn't maybe got the audience, particularly in America, that I think it deserves, is because a few critics have said, well, you know, should we be using something as serious as the killing of African Americans by police officers as the fodder for kind of a genre crime movie? And I can sort of see that, but part of the fun of the Lovers on the Run movie is that it is always kind of political. We find that Bonnie and Clyde are justified in what they do because in the universe of the movie, they're living through the Great Depression. In our universe, of course, Bonnie and Clyde was released in the 60s and it became such a touchstone of the counterculture. So there's always something in the air that makes these movies more than just crime films, something that connects them into a wider social context. I think maybe the problem is that, as I say, Bonnie and Clyde, while interpreted at the time as commentary on the 1960s, was set in the 1920s. This is commenting on the era it's set in, and maybe that makes it too raw for people, but I think it pulls it off fantastically. It still has the sense of escape and liberty that the best Lovers on the Run movies have. I think the two leads are fantastic. There is a lovely bit where Queen is enjoying sort of leaning out of the window while Slim drives, and she offers to drive for a bit herself so that Slim can do this. And what you get is a wonderful contrast between Jodie Turner-Smith playing this as a kind of iconic moment of liberation and Daniel Kaluuya playing this like he's very, very scared he's going to fall out of the car at any minute. that kind of tonal balancing act is kind of the whole movie, really. It has a lot of joy, it has a lot of beauty it has fantastic cinematography by Tat Radcliffe, who shot the British film 71 about the soldier left behind in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Here he's working in that kind of register that you see in Bradford Young's cinematography, his work for directors like Ava DuVernay, where it's shot using very low natural light and maybe the odd bits of like street lights or neon lights picking out highlights. It's very moody, very chic. It fills the wide screen. One of the things that widescreen is always great for is car windscreens, so a road movie's a pretty good one for that. It has some moments of really devastating tension. Like, fairly early on, they run out of petrol and they hitch a lift with someone who appears quite nice at first, but then Slim spots a sheriff's badge in his glove compartment, and they have to calculate whether this guy is as nice as he seems or whether he's going to turn on them once he turns on the police radio and realises who he's giving a lift to. It also delves into the idea that of kind of, was it Eric Hobsbawm who came up with the idea of the social bandit? Again, talking sort of back to the kind of Robin Hood idea of a criminal whose morality somehow chimes with a wider society and is seen as liberating. Of course, one of the things about doing a Loves on the Run movie in the modern age is that Queen and Slim's crime doesn't just, become something that the police are looking for them for. It becomes something that goes viral. It becomes something that inspires protests. They pass murals of themselves. So it grasps the opportunities that are inherent in doing this very classic kind of crime story now. I think I took a while to settle into it. I mean, I think part of the problem is, I say problem, it's the right decision, but part of the reason why it takes a while to get into is because the first scene is two people in a diner failing to spark off each other at all. But,
yeah.
By the end of the film, Kaluuya and Turner Smith have so much chemistry that you're genuinely impressed that they could look like two absolutely cold fish at the start there. I think it was maybe a mistake to release it in Oscar season. I think if this was put out in a time like March or September, the releases aren't as defined, people would appreciate that it has more of a mix of things. It's more sort of genre-based, more enjoyable than you might expect from an Oscar season release. On the other hand, it's actually more downbeat and kind of character-driven and slowly paced than you might expect from something that is, as Bokeem Woodbine says, Black Bonnie and Clyde. It's got a real mix of tones, and I think that's been a problem for it at the box office, but I think when people see it without preconceptions, they will realise that all of those difficult clashing tones were the right thing to do. I think it's a great debut from Matsoukas, and it has an absolutely gorgeous score from Devontae Hines, who records under I think Blood Orange is his current moniker. He's one of those guys who skips through pseudonyms, but it's a beautiful mixture of kind of classical film score stuff, but also black music through the ages. It's got some jazz, some trap, some blues, some gospel, soul, in that kind of mode that people like Hines or Kendrick Lamar have introduced to pop music, where you can make a whole album that's just the history of African American music, and it's gorgeous and moody and so right. So, for all it's had its troubles in terms of mass acclaim, but I think Queen and Slim is a really terrific film that is well worth seeking out.
As I understand it, from what I'm reading, it starts with Queen and Slim on a date that they arrange via Tinder.
It does, yes, yeah. That's true.
Well, given your commentary on Lovers on the Run movies, doesn't that suggest the idea that really what we need is a dedicated app for meeting up with someone with whom you go on the run? not merely going on a date, but...
Yeah, the film itself makes a great case for going on a cross-country crime spree as just the sort of thing to get your relationship going again.
Yeah. I don't know if you really want a dating app, where you encourage people to kill a police officer. I mean, that might be... Yeah.
Legally, it's problematic, yeah.
Let's not encourage that strongly on this podcast. So anyway, back to the real world.
Yes, let's take a look at what's coming out next week. Well, next week, I mean, there are some weeks where we try and create some suspense about what film of the week is, but I think anyone who knows us will know that that's not going to happen this week. Next week, we're doing Parasite.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Parasite looks dead good, I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, it couldn't have been anything else, but just quickly, let's log up some of the other releases that will be completely overshadowed by a subtitled Korean movie. First up, there's a reissue of Elia Kazan's classic A Streetcar Named Desire with Vivian Leigh and Marlon Brando. There is Deep Breath here, Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn.
Wait, what? Is that just the title of that movie?
That is the full title, yes. I'm not being sarcastic.
Okay, fine.
Contrarily, a film that was greenlit as The Voyage of Dr. Dolittle has been released as just Dolittle, and that reductionist aesthetic has also applied to its box office profits.
This is the film, as I understand it, where Robert Downey Jr. gives an enema to a Tyrannosaurus.
Oh, no, that's silly. It's a dragon.
Okay, sure. Which is very, very specialist, to be honest. It doesn't really appeal to my particular tastes. And obviously, I think the public in general is probably going to feel the same way about that, or inevitably. Yeah.
Yes. We have Underwater by William Eubank, a film that has been delayed so long that when it was made, it was acceptable to cast T.J. Miller. So that's been on the shelf a while. We have a film I don't know much about, Mr. Jones, which I mentioned because it's a new film by Agnieszka Holland, the unpatriotically named Polish director who's done some good stuff in the past. We have Daniel Isn't Real, a new horror movie with Patrick Schwarzenegger and Sacha Lane that Rob spent the end of last year being angry about. And a 4K restoration of Alejandro Jodorowsky's Fando and Liz. And there's Parasite, which, let's face it, is the one you care about. Parasite. That's it. Parasite.
I'll pick one of those to watch in some way. I'm meant to be on next week, aren't I?
You are, yes.
There's a lot of people who just tune in for me, I mean, there's
it's true, yeah.
There's many more who just tune out for me, So it's probably not a net gain.
But yes, next week we are doing Parasite, but until then, that's been your lot from Eclectica. I've been Graham.
And I've been Tim.
See you next week.